The trigger you choose for your AR can completely change how your rifle feels, but no one trigger feels the same. So choosing the one that fits your preferences can make a subtle or drastic change in how you perform. In this video, we're breaking down 3 popular and trusted AR triggers on the market: the LaRue MBT-2S, the Geissele SSA-E, and the TriggerTech Duty trigger. We're also going to talk about the differences between cassette triggers and 2-piece triggers, single stage versus 2-stage, and the history behind each of these triggers' development. So if you're looking for the right trigger for your next build, this video will give you the clarity you've been looking for. Before we dive too deep into this video, I want to give a huge thank you to Barbell Apparel for sponsoring this video. If you've been following me for a while, you know I care about training hard and moving efficiently, whether it be at the range or at the gym. Barbell Apparel makes clothing that moves with you, stretches where you need it to, and holds up in real-world scenarios. I've been running their pants and tops during training sessions, and they've quickly become my go-to because of how comfortable and functional they are. If you want high-quality clothing that performs, check out Barbell Apparel using the link below. And again, thank you Barbell Apparel for sponsoring this video. Before we compare each individual trigger, we need to talk about one of the biggest design differences that you could be running: cassette triggers versus traditional triggers. Cassette triggers are one of those things that sound simple, like a drop-in trigger, but they have a lot more going on under the hood. On an AR-15 platform, the fire control group is normally made of separate parts, but in a cassette trigger, most or all of those parts are built into the self-contained module, which typically looks like a little metal box or a housing that holds the entire mechanism. And what you do is drop that housing into your lower receiver and line it up with the pinholes and install your trigger and hammer pins when you're done. Now, the pros to this is that they're really easy to install. They have a clean break, and the manufacturer has control over the tolerances. But some of the cons of a cassette trigger is that if debris does get into the housing, there's no easy way to clean it, or if at all, depending on the design. Also, fitment can vary depending on what lower you're running, because not all lowers are spec'd exactly the same. And staying on that topic, you might want to get anti-walking pins just in case you see that your pins are backing out under recoil. It might not happen with every AR, but it is a common theme for cassette triggers because there isn't something pressing down on the pins. Now, when you move over to 2-stage triggers, all those components that I listed are installed semi-separately. And what I mean by that is that they aren't sealed inside of a housing, which is why when people are building a duty rifle, they typically use one of these. When something is going wrong, they're easier to inspect, and overall, I just really like the feel of traditional triggers. You're gonna be a little bit more involved when installing these, and you do have to install it right. If you install them wrong, the trigger's just not gonna work, or you're gonna give yourself a dead trigger, or it may not function properly. Neither system is universally better. Both will get the job done, and it really comes down to preference and knowledge. Now, once you know what type of trigger you want, you need to determine if you would like a single stage or 2-stage trigger. A single stage trigger moves directly into the break. There's no creep, which means it's excellent for fast shooting and close range engagements. Some people like this. I'm actually not a fan of that, just because I like to have that extra safety or that creep before I actually have to break the trigger. And if you want to find that creep, that's when you move over to 2-stage triggers. So all my rifles, I run 2-stage triggers. This one actually came as a single stage, but I decided to throw a 2-stage in it because I just want to keep everything streamlined and familiar for me when I'm changing platforms. Another cool thing on 2-stage triggers is that once you've moved through the take-up, the break can be very, very light. I don't really feel comfortable running a very light 1-stage trigger. I think the lowest I would go would probably be 4.5 to maybe 5 pounds. But on these, I'm more than comfortable going past that 3-pound mark. But again, this comes down to preference. I do know people that prefer a single stage trigger, but for the most part, a lot of people that I know run a 2-stage trigger. All right, that's enough wasting time. Let's talk about each of these triggers individually, starting with the LaRue MBT-2S. So LaRue Tactical was founded by Mark LaRue in Texas, and the company quickly earned a reputation for rugged, precision-matched components. Their mounts and rifles are trusted by shooters who demand durability. When high-end triggers became expensive and hard to get, Mark LaRue set out to create a trigger that offered the same premium feel, but at a fraction of the cost. And that vision produced the MBT-2S. The MBT-2S typically has a 4 to 4.5 pound pull while maintaining a solid wall and a clean break. Now, I've been running the MBT-2S for probably 4 or 5 months now, and I really like it. As you can see, it's on my Griffin 14.5, and it has been flawless. I've used this gun in running guns, 2-gun matches, and scoped carbine matches. And I've had 0 hiccups with the trigger. All right, so let's go over the trigger itself and my opinions on it. So you do get a pretty wide face. I feel like this is probably the widest trigger that I have. I know that doesn't really make any sense to a lot of people, but for me, if you're shooting or you're shooting multiple triggers, you'll know what I'm talking about. It just feels like it has a very wide face. And just to so you guys know, this is clear. Now the take-up is actually very refined. It's very pronounced. So once you get to that wall, it lets you know that it's there. And then when you're pulling through, you get a nice crisp break. Now, I'm a huge fan of how this feels. I've had 0 issues running this trigger fast. And when a lot of people get this trigger, they say it's about 80% of what a Geissele is. Now, in my personal opinion, 80% does seem pretty accurate. I'd probably say it's closer to 70%, because when I have run Geiseles, I do feel a pretty substantial difference, but this is a viable option and it is much cheaper than a Geissele. So if you're on a budget, I would definitely recommend this over a lot of other triggers, simply because I think it is the most bang for your buck that you can get. Okay, so since I was directly comparing the MBT-2S to the Geissele, I figured it makes sense just to pull the Geissele up next. The Geissele SSA-E is one of the most respected precision duty triggers ever made, and their designs quickly caught the attention of US military units. These units needed a 2-stage trigger that was rugged, safe, consistent, and reliable in combat. This collaboration produced several military triggers and eventually the civilian SSA. But shooters wanted something lighter and more refined, which led to the creation of the SSA-E, or Super Semi-Automatic Enhanced. The pull weight of the SSA-E averages around 3 to 3.5 pounds, and it offers one of the cleanest second stage brakes in today's market. The reset is really short and decisive and extremely consistent. This trigger is really popular in the competition world because of how rugged it is, but how light it feels when you're trying to run it fast. All right, so funny enough, out of all my triggers, this one has the least amount of rounds through it. The other 2 triggers have been the ones I've had on my rifles for a long period of time, but I found a really good deal when it came to this trigger and I couldn't pass it up. So I ended up buying one and I've been really impressed, and so far, I have to say, it is my favorite trigger out of the bunch. Just starting with the feel, this trigger is a little bit thinner than the LaRue MBT, and I honestly really like that. It kind of gives you a more of a precision feel. Obviously, that shouldn't affect how you shoot, but like I said earlier, having your preferences met can really change how you feel when you're shooting, and in turn can change how you might perform. Preferences do matter to a certain extent, but the take-up does feel like it's a little bit more than the LaRue, but the thing I like the most about this trigger is how light the brake is. Because of how light this brake is, I find that I'm a lot more accurate with this rifle at distance. And every time I go back to the LaRue from this trigger, I do feel a struggle trying to break my shots. Now, it's nothing major and I'm kind of over exaggerating this to a bit, but when you're going back and forth, you really do feel the difference between the Geissele and the LaRue. But again, I want to emphasize that the LaRue is not a horrible trigger by any means. I just think that when you're using the Geissele, you will feel that 20 to 30% improvement. So again, I'll show you guys that take-up does feel a little bit longer than the MBT, but the brake is so light and so clean that, man, I just can't get over that. All right, moving over to the last trigger, and this is the TriggerTech Duty trigger. Now, I believe TriggerTech originally engineered triggers for crossbows and then later moved on to firearms. Their design gave a lot of shooters a uniquely smooth and consistent feel, but professional users needed something tougher and more debris resistant. So TriggerTech created the Duty series and sealed and reinforced the Cassette trigger. Now, the Duty trigger comes in 2 configurations, a 5-pound trigger pull and a 3.5-pound trigger pull. I went with the 3.5-pound because I felt like 5 pounds you're pretty much getting right back over to mil spec. Now, TriggerTech also has some new technology where there's 0 creep into the brake. Both of the other triggers I showed you, they feel pretty crisp, especially the Geissele. But when it comes to the brake, I feel like the TriggerTech Duty trigger is almost there to the Geissele. So, looking at this trigger, there's a pretty short take-up. It's not as short as the MBT, but it is pretty short in my opinion. And I find the take-up to be in between the MBT and the Geissele having the longest. But the brake at 3.5 pounds, really nice. Now, I truly believe that they are right when it comes to that zero creep because you hit a hard wall. And again, it doesn't take a lot to get through that wall, but when you get to that wall, there's zero creep. It just snaps once you get to the breaking point. And this is why I decided to put it on my Project SPR build. Now, I want to preface that this isn't the most premium trigger that TriggerTech has, but it's the one I wanted to go with because this rifle wasn't configured the way it is right now when I bought the trigger. They do have much lighter triggers and they do have precision oriented triggers on their website. But the Duty trigger is nothing to sleep on. It's definitely better than any mil-spec trigger that's out there in my opinion. And I think it's comparable to the other two that I showed you earlier. All right, so which trigger should you get? Now, if you aren't the most mechanically inclined, but you want something that's very crisp, that has a lot of new technology built into it, and is consistent, I would say go with the TriggerTech. It was by far the easiest one to install, and since I went with the Duty route, I've had zero issues with debris or shooting in adverse conditions. And I've shot this rifle in the rain, I've rolled around in Georgia clay, and I've shot on very dusty days as well, and I've had zero issues, even though cassette triggers are more inclined to fail in those conditions. Now, if you're looking for something that's going to be a little bit more robust, that has a very clean break, and is a little bit more budget oriented, then I would say go with the MBT. This is nothing to sleep on. Like most people say, it's 70 to 80% of what the Geissele is, and I have full faith in its reliability and consistency. Now, if you have a little bit of money to spend and you want more of an experience out of your AR, then I would say go with the Geissele SSA-E. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but this isn't even the top of the line trigger for Geissele. They have an SSA-E-X with a straight bow shoe, and that is probably the best trigger I've ever felt. But this comes pretty close to that in regards to performance. And because I found such a good deal on this trigger, I ended up buying two of them. And the second one is going to be going into my main competition rifle. Regardless of what you choose, all of these are excellent triggers, and they're not the only ones on the market. I did a lot of research, and these were the top 3 that I chose. This does not mean these are the top 3 in the entire industry, but the Geissele and the LaRue are pretty common amongst a lot of people. People typically use TriggerTech in more precision builds, and they use their higher end triggers, but I really wanted to shine some light on their Duty trigger because I don't think enough people talk about it. So yeah, here are the top triggers that I recommend to most shooters. If you guys have other triggers that you would want to recommend, leave that down below and let me know your experiences with them. But that's all I have for you guys today. As always, I'll catch you guys on the next one.